Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for this event. We know that it's getting to the end of the 2 weeks of the COP, and everyone is probably tired from the negotiations. But we have two members of the facilitative working group of the Local Communities and Indigenous Platform here on the stage with us. And for them, it is time for them to relax because their last activity has just concluded. But this afternoon, we will be talking about the contributions of Indigenous peoples in Asia to the fulfillment of the Paris Agreement. This event is live streamed. So we have people from Asia who were not able to join us here listening, I hope, to the live stream. And we have interpretation to Spanish because we also work in solidarity with our Spanish-speaking brothers and sisters. So Indigenous peoples in the world experience various and differentiated impacts of climate change on their livelihoods, culture, and well-being. These negative impacts are usually exacerbated, made worse by the national domestic law. And in particular in Asia, we struggle because most Indigenous peoples in Asia are not recognized as such, and there are no laws protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples. So this event will showcase various initiatives of Indigenous peoples across Asia towards fulfilling the Paris Agreement. We will speak of a broad spectrum of activities, like how Indigenous youth are stepping up to the plate to address climate change. We will also talk about the interface between climate, peace, conflict, and freedom of movement, and the need for Indigenous peoples to raise the next generation of Indigenous leaders. So we have a gender-balanced and regionally balanced panel this afternoon. So 2 men, 2 women, and some from South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East and North Asia, I would say. So to my extreme right is Mrinal, Kanti, Tripura, who is from the Chittagong Hill Tracts in Bangladesh. He is the Executive Director of Malaya Foundation, and they work a lot on conflict transformation. Next to him is Pasang Dolma Sherpa. She is the Executive Director of CIPRED in Nepal, and she is also currently the Facilitative Working Group member, Indigenous for Asia, and she was the former chair of the FWG. Then we have Monica Ndoen, who is from Indonesia. She is the Special Envoy, I want to get this right, Special Envoy to the Secretary General of AMAN, or which is the National Network of Indigenous Peoples in Indonesia, on international affairs. And then to my right is Rodion Sulyandziga, who is from the Center for Support of Indigenous Peoples in the North, from Russia. And we're claiming him. Actually, if we talk of the indigenous social-cultural regions, Russia is separate from Asia. But if we talk about the way that the UN divides regions, 3/4 of Russia is actually in Asia. So we are claiming Rodion. But he is also a facilitative working group member for the sociocultural region of Russia. So I have some questions for the panel this afternoon, and let us start with the youngest in the panel. And I would like to ask Monica, can you please tell us more about the contributions of Indigenous youth to climate change adaptation and mitigation?
Thank you, Jing. As mentioned, my name is Monica. I'm from Indonesia, and currently I'm with the Indigenous Peoples Alliance of the Archipelago, or we known as AMAN. So it's actually a very good question to show the role and contribution of Indigenous peoples, in particular Indigenous youth, in the mitigation and adaptation of climate change, because we know that the 80% of the remaining world biodiversity is in indigenous territories. And it's also proof that we are the one who protecting the nature, protecting the Mother Earth. And that's what we do. And also there is this one study that conducted by RRI. It shows that from what they can document, there's 250 billion metric ton carbon stock within indigenous territories at the global level. So it shows that we are the one who really the guardian of the nature, the Mother Earth. And if we talk about the role of indigenous people, indigenous youth, where we play a big role in that, because, for example, I give an example from Indonesia. We have this homecoming movement. So it's basically a movement to call all the youth that used to live in the city to go back to the communities and help, the elders and the member of the community to defend their land. And not only that, now we also have indigenous schools. So we're trying to protect the traditional language, the language of indigenous peoples, because nowadays with all the formal educations, many indigenous youth started to go out from the communities, and they also forget about, their own language. And that's also be part of this, that indigenous schools. And, we ask the leaders, the elders, to be the teachers, to, transfer the knowledge and everything. And it's very important, if we talk about the identity of indigenous peoples, to transfer knowledge to indigenous youth. And calling back the indigenous youth to the communities. And now we have 82 indigenous schools initiated by indigenous youth. And it's very important for indigenous peoples and the identity. And not only that, we currently have 118 indigenous enterprises, 30 of those led by indigenous youth. So there's this agriculture, plantation, livestock, and fisheries that, be part of the development of indigenous economy. And it's also important to show that, indigenous peoples, indigenous youth can contribute to the economic of the country, that it is possible to show the government that data. So we have 30 now. And then we also now trying to document all the data that exists in the community, because sometimes it's only here, right? And then when we want to be recognized, we want our rights to be secured and translated into legal framework, we have to show it by evidence. It should be written. Well, it's actually not the original way of indigenous people. It's always here. But now we are trying to write it down, the history and everything. And indigenous youth are the one who led this initiative even until now. So each of like elders, women, indigenous youth, including women, they have their own role in this whole process. And indigenous youth really contribute a lot on this. So, and currently we have 857 communities data collection, and 250 among them collected and documented by youth. Because this is, I think it's very important to also, tell other indigenous youth in different countries about this movement. Maybe they could be inspired by the work that we have done in Indonesia, and it keeps expanding even until now. So, even when we do that efforts, we're still, in a risk of criminalization, harassment, threats, and everything, because that's why it's also important for us that our rights to be secured and translated into legal framework, and all these efforts will contribute to that goal. I think that's all. Thank you, Jing.
Thank you so much. You have more time actually if you want to, but more time for discussion later. But thank you so much, Monica, for that presentation. And I think it's very important to involve indigenous youth, as we've been hearing all throughout this conference. President Obama just had his address, and he said that indigenous youth are natural allies against climate change. And it's important that we harness the voices of indigenous youth so that they can speak to the older generation who are not as aware of climate change. And I think also it's very important what you shared, Monica. Yeah, maybe you want to add?
I just want to add a little bit more. All these efforts, it shows that we're trying to also protect the remaining carbon stock within our territories, because the government always talk about the reduction of carbon emission. But at the other hand, we don't have our rights secured. It means that, if the government recognize and protect our rights, it means the government allow us to contribute to the mitigation and adaptation of climate change and to protect the carbon stock within our territories. Because if not, we have proof anywhere that when our territories are given to big concessions, they will just cut down the trees and everything. So we're doing these efforts, and the government has to, support us with the recognition and protection with the legal basis.
I think, yeah, that's a very, very important point, Monica, because I think it's very remarkable what Indigenous peoples and Indigenous youth in Indonesia have done, despite the fact that there is no Indigenous peoples law yet in Indonesia. So imagine how much more they can be doing if the rights are recognized. So thank you very much for sharing that, Monica. And now we move beauty before age, I guess. So we go again next to the other woman in our panel. So Pasang, I would like to ask you, now that you have time to relax after the whirlwind activities of the FWG, what can community-based management and information systems contribute to climate actions? And maybe you can tell us a little bit about your work in Nepal.
Thank you, Jing. And first of all, thank you very much for your invitation to be in the panel to share how Indigenous peoples, Indigenous women, or our communities on the ground contributed for the Paris agreements. Especially our work on the ground has contributed which has been under the shadow in the discourse of climate change. The community-based monitoring information system that CIPRED has been carrying over since few years in partnership with Tebtebba and also with our ELATIA partnership to make it as a model for the whole world to show that how our traditional governance system, with the help of our customary institution, contributed for maintaining, monitoring, and also keeping the same space for intact of the forest, biodiversity, ecosystem, which are the main basis for climate change resilience. So far, like in the climate change discourse, the big voice are heard there, but the Indigenous voice were hardly been heard. But our work actually on the ground level started, our voice to be heard by the local government, national government, ultimately hear this space to be the global forum that the contribution of Indigenous peoples through our customary governance system, institution have played a major role both for physical and the spiritual and cultural. Physical, we all are already aware that Indigenous people on the ground already suffering from drought, precipitation patterns, changes of the precipitation patterns, floods, outburst of state of the glaciers, melting ice. No, there are so many physical things that you can see it, the changes of the climate change. Already our vegetation, our crop pattern, Indigenous seeds, not changes we are seeing. However, the invisible changes, the experience by Indigenous peoples is beyond our catch, and that has not been captured in the discourse of climate change in line with the Paris agreements. And if you really want to fulfill the Paris agreements, the invisible changes, especially our faith, our knowledge, our skills, our spiritual value, that has a big contribution for the intact of our resources, and that need to be counted in the discourse of climate change so that our faith, our sovereignty, our self-respect, our dignity will be continued by the young generation. Then another part is, one of the most challenging part is disaggregated data. Indigenous peoples are keep on falling behind because we do not have data to show. What is the role of Indigenous people in the discourse of climate change? Yeah, you are so vulnerable. Oh, you are really, very poor. This is not the way. The disaggregated data to show the indigenous people who are forefront to the impacts of climate change, a big contribution, as my sister already mentioned, the contribution of indigenous people in safeguarding the natural resources, climate change resilience. So with the help of the disaggregated data collecting from the CBMISC, community-based monitoring information system, is a basis to show how indigenous peoples have been dealing with the impacts of climate change, still adapting, still building the resilience to the impacts of climate change, despite the fact our voice not been heard, or despite the fact that our participation, meaningful participation, is not there in the discourse of climate change, in the formation of policies and strategic governance system. Then finally, I would like to highlight that CBMIS projects has given a big opportunity to work on the principle of IPSSDD, Indigenous Peoples' Sustainable Self-Determined Development. This is the basic principle that we develop the initiatives based on our values, what we needed. And the information we have collected to the CBMIS, that become a very basis for coming up with the principles of IPSSDD for the community-led initiatives. But also the information is very helpful for the local government. So the awareness level, capacity building, and especially sensitization the local government that how indigenous people have been contributing and why it is important for them to listen. And that has built a kind of synergy among the local government that CIPRED has been working with in partnership, in fact, and especially for them, when they build a plan for the community, they also started inviting indigenous people leaders for information. And apart from the CBMIS, in line with the CBMIS, to strengthen the CBMIS, we have been already working on the ground, the recognition of the customary governance system, the recognition of the land tenure security, the recognition of the forest tenure security, so that indigenous peoples will no more be criminalized. Indigenous people no more be, evicted or, not being caught into prisons just only just for fishing or just for collecting the herbs that from the forest the ancestors have been protected for generation. So this is we have already doing. We have been already started with our efforts, and now we have CIPRED has already come up. I'm not sure. Do we have some time? Okay. So CIPRED has already come up with the 5 municipality, rural municipality and municipality working in Nepal in 3 districts, and these 3 districts we are working with the local government, and in line with the Constitution of Nepal 2015, there is a provision of coming up with the local laws in forest. Biodiversity management of the resources can be developed by the local laws. So stepping on this provision, and also the provision of, in line with the provision of the Constitution, we are already started working on with our local government, sensitizing them importance of indigenous role and contribution. And in fact, the good news is out of the 7 municipality and rural municipality, all they have now the local laws. This is a really, I think this is one of the first time in the history of Nepal coming up with the local laws recognizing customary institution of indigenous people. We should be proud, but the big challenges we ahead of is how we implement. That is another challenge and another responsibility on our soldier to make sure the approved local laws that recognize indigenous people customary institution, our governance system, so that our children can be follow up to be implemented in faithful manner. So that is the challenges we have, but we have not given hope. We'll work on further and give the opportunity for our young generation that they will continue the work so that we can live with the respect, dignity, and happiness actually, to be as indigenous peoples and to be a protector of the mother nature. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pasang. I think that is a recurring theme. Indigenous peoples are largely using oral traditions, but because we need to make visible what is invisible, we have engaged with the mainstream requirement to write down the knowledge and our worldviews that help us become good stewards of the environment and to contribute to climate change. So thanks so much, Pasang, for telling us about your experience in Nepal and how it actually aligns very closely with what you're doing at the FWG, no? So we're trying to make Indigenous peoples visible here at the global level. So I'm really happy to hear that at the national level, there are also efforts. Yes, maybe next round. Okay. So now we go to another place in South Asia, Bangladesh. And I'd like to invite Mrinal to talk about conflict sensitivity and conflict transformation. How is it, what is it and how does it contribute to climate change action? Climate action.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Jennifer, for giving me the opportunity to share our experience on conflict sensitivity and conflict transformation. The last two paragraphs of previous speaker, Dr. Pasang, was on violence, conflict, no, like eviction, killing, and also the last paragraph, last sentence, he said about the happiness or peace. So what I'm going to talk in my brief 10 minutes talks, I would like to just share the basic things. As we know, human beings are always, our life, conflict is part and parcel of our life. So when we talk about conflict, I think it's also important for us to understand, to distinguish between conflict and violence. So violence is different thing, as we know, conflict, because conflict is normal in our life. But when conflict is not dealt with, dealt properly, then sometimes it becomes violence. So that's why what we talk here is on conflict, mainly conflict sensitivity and conflict transformation, and in relation to the climate action, because we are here on the climate change conference now. So we know that especially indigenous peoples there in the context where they live in is really with a lot of conflicts. So that is why our organization, Malaya Foundation, we decided that we have to work on conflict. Usually, there are three types. Sometimes we do not work on conflict. We just work around conflict. Some say, oh, it is their matter. The problem is with them. So we keep away from that. We don't want to get involved with their conflicts. Sometimes we say that is around conflict. And when we say, okay, we have to work there are conflicts, but we have to work in that context. So how can we work? That's another strategy, how to work in conflict. And then if we really want to change the conflict into something good for future, then we call it working on conflict. So Malaya, our organization, and our networks, we work on conflict. So that's just for your clarification why it is important. And now conflict sensitivity, as you know, especially I would just like to say here the 8 related to conflict, because in this discussion, we know someone $100 billion, $20 billion, some, and many organizations, many donors, they come with many aid resources to our places, for example. Then again, this aid is not neutral. Whenever aid goes to the conflicting situation, then it may decrease the conflict or improve something good situation, or it may deteriorate the existing conflict situation if we do not deal with very carefully. So that's why we have to be conflict sensitive. Here, just very briefly, I would say, in every conflict context, there are both dividers and connectors. There are some things that can divide the conflicting parties more, or there are also connectors, connectors who can connect all the conflicting parties and they can work together for something good. So in that sense, so whenever we go to the conflicting situation, we have to be very careful. No, we have to be adjustable, adaptable. So just very briefly, and also we sometimes when like for example in the refugee camps, when the donors go there, and if something's wrong happen, the donor they can fly very rapidly by helicopter, but the local actors there, they have to stay there. Then what the ethical message is going to the local people? These donor people, they just came, they come here to enjoy, to do their leisure something. I mean, different kind of negative ethical message can go to the people. So all these things, I mean, very briefly, very quickly, so we need to be very conflict sensitive so that we do not do more harm, rather we do something good. So now come to the conflict transformation. We know when many of us, we are familiar with conflict, conflict management, conflict resolution, and conflict mitigation, no? But why we choose the terminology transformation? Because when we see conflict management, we just manage the conflict. It doesn't address the justice, doesn't address the rights, no? So, and when we say conflict resolution, when we say solution, like here also we talk about climate solution. When we say solution, that means it has problem. We solve problem, that means problem is being solved. That is why solution. But when we say transformation, we don't only solve the problem. We also solve the problem. In the same time, we find something better for the future, something constructive. So, conflict, because conflict conflict has so many layers of interest. People has many layers of interest. So one you solve, you have to have another conflict, because we can easily understand. Now, while I was young, my interest was chocolate, no? But when I grown up, no more chocolate. My interest is different thing. So it keeps changing. So conflict also very complex, and conflict keeps changing. So we have to transform. We can transform them from the bad to the good. We cannot solve it. We can just transform it from bad things to the good things, from destructive to the constructive. That's why we call it conflict transformation. And here, the main thing to me is why indigenous peoples organizations, we need to be familiarized with this approach, the conflict sensitivity and conflict transformation, because comparing to the other actors, like the state, for example, who are violating the rights of indigenous peoples, we are, our power relation, in terms of power relation, we are far, far below the states, no? So when we do this approach, we have to have the systemic conflict analysis mapping, no? We call it systemic conflict analysis. Using various tools, we can do the analysis. We have the mapping, and there we can find ourselves as organization, as individual, and all the actors and all the key driving factors and their relationships. Because when we talk about conflict transformation, it is all about relationship, relation between individuals, relation between agencies or agents, relation between this country and that country. So that main thing is to change the relation into positive things. So that is the main essence of the conflict transformation, to change the relation from negative to positive, from destructive relationship to constructive relationship. That is the, and here when we see the map, we can easily identify who influenced whom, because we are weaker in all sense in relation to our counterpart. So we have to be very strategic. Then we have to identify the entry points, the key driving factors, because sometimes we work a lot of, we do a lot of things, but if we do not do the right thing at the right point, then we'll be just not dancing on the same stage whole day, but not going ahead like this. So in that sense, I think it is important to understand us and to go ahead, and finally, then we will not get frustrated. Sometimes otherwise, when we see we are not moving ahead, we get frustrated. So if we follow this approach, then we can also know the clear picture of the entire situation. That is, that helps us a lot. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Mrinal. And I think that's very important because, as you rightly pointed out, all of these funds that are potentially going to Indigenous peoples could cause conflict. And it's important for Indigenous peoples to know how to address these types of conflict. So thanks. And now we go last but not the least, certainly. We go to North or East Asia, to Rodion. And I wanted to ask him, because conflict is also very much a part of the lives of Indigenous peoples and activists in Russia. So you've had very recent experiences of closing of democratic spaces. So what does Indigenous people's rights and democracy have to do with climate change, Rodion?
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you very much, Jennifer, for having me today at this quite important panel. Before moving to that issue, I just also like to contribute why I'm here. Even I'm from the Russian Federation, as a different social culture region. But Russia is a very huge country. And most of Russian indigenous peoples are living in Asian part of their country. So even if you look at Siberia, it's an Asian territory. So I'm here today not just to provide my solidarity with strong Asian indigenous people movement, but also being a part of Asia. So, and thank you very much again. And the question and my topic raised, it sounds for me not just interesting or to some extent more general, but it sounds very substantial and very fundamental in terms of indigenous people rights. And I believe that climate action is a bottom-up initiative. Much of the progress our planet has made is thanks to the work of activists and civil society groups with the strong engagement and contribution of indigenous peoples. While international organizations and governments fail to introduce a binding climate change document, it is these groups who blocked and continue to block many destructive projects all over the world through successful campaign. If a government is not accountable to its people who do not have a say in any matters affecting their futures, success will be minimal. And it is also about political will that drives climate change and climate actions, because the earliest way to slow down the progress and ultimately block climate actions is to silence indigenous peoples, the most vulnerable, yet but the most empowered with nature-based knowledge group. Therefore, human rights-based approach are key and central to the progress on climate change. The story of relationship with the natural world is a story of both victories and success. But more often is a story of failure, but not failure of people's struggles and determination, but the perpetual failure of policy reforms, respect, and recognition. Importantly, while indigenous peoples are at the frontline defense for our future, defending the planet has never been more fatal for them. In 2019, for instance, it was reported that 30% of the land and environmental defenders who lost their lives belong to indigenous peoples. Therefore, it must not be forgotten that aside from natural causes, deforestation and land grabbing have other multiple roots, including uncontrolled exploitation of natural resources, unjust laws, and policies. In hopes to change the situation, ironically, indigenous peoples address political, economic, and legal systems that are not of their own making. They are forced to participate in structure and procedures designed, constructed, and managed by governments who continue to act as the guardians to a group of people they have reduced in number, name, and spirit. Indigenous peoples consistently outperform governments as the most efficient guardians of nature and ecosystem, and the strongest leaders of climate and biodiversity crisis management. Significantly, the strengths of the traditional indigenous nature-based solution to climate change offer empowering alternatives to existing systems, which are very sound, ecologically, sustainable, diversified, and self-determined. And yet, while indigenous peoples occupy more than half of the world land, governments only recognize indigenous legal ownership of 10% of the world's lands. The population who needs their land and the most are the first to lose it. And the key message is democracy and human rights for climate change means putting people first, and for once, ignoring economic interests of extractive industry, dirty and environmental non-friendly business like oil and gas companies. There is a clear disconnection between those experiencing climate change and those elaborating plans to save the planet. Changing the power imbalance between those who are at the front line of climate crisis and those who profit from it. That is the strength of human rights approach. Notwithstanding struggles and limited numbers, indigenous communities do have a significant role to play globally. In my opinion, change is inevitable. Progress is inevitable. Indigenous story is a story that celebrates their survival and proves they can only move forward. Where the governments often build walls, indigenous peoples and civil society activists could greatly influence the well-being and shape the future of a new global agenda and new inclusive social contract. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rodion. I really like very much what you said, and I'm glad that we saved you for last because you always have such beautiful and wise words for us. And I think I completely agree with what you said. We've heard all over here that indigenous peoples are doing a good job, but I think Rodion brings another angle to that picture, and he says that the best way to ensure that we do not achieve 1.5 degrees is to criminalize, to persecute, and to disenfranchise indigenous peoples. Therefore, we really need a human rights-based approach as well as recognition of indigenous tenure in order to strengthen climate action. So thank you very much to the panel. Now we turn to the audience. So do we have questions? Yes, the lady in pink, please. And please introduce yourself so that we can take note.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Dolapo Fasawe. I come from Africa, Nigeria. And it is amazing to hear about conflict resolution. Where I come from, sub-Saharan Africa, it's the other way around. Indigenous people are causing desertification with cattle. The nomadic herdsmen, they come, eat up the grasses, cut the trees, and in conflict resolution, when government tries to say, listen, guys, when you cut trees, you plant. When your cattle grazes, you replace. We get killed, not the other way around. So that's a different perspective from all I have heard here. How do we deal with indigenous people with guns and bows and arrows coming at us climate change fighters to say, listen, you don't eat and desertify here. The cattle in Nigeria are moving more and more from the deserts into the greenlands. And the more we try to say, save our wetlands, save our wet greenlands, the more we get killed. Because these people are not bound by law. It's traditional law and survival of the fittest. How do we deal with that conflict resolution when it is the other way around? Thank you.
And fortunately, we have someone from the Indigenous Peoples Africa Coordinating Committee here, because I'm afraid that we are all from Asia, and this is an event on Asia Indigenous Peoples' contribution to addressing climate change. No, but in the audience, we have Dr. Ndoen Mohammed, who is from Morocco, and he is the head of the Indigenous Peoples Africa Coordinating Committee. So I'd like to invite you, please, Dr. Ndoen. And he will be speaking in Spanish, so please get your headsets.
Spanish. Porque no hay traducción en francés.
We can speak Spanish. Because there's no... Oh, what channel?
I can speak French? Okay.
Channel 4 for English. Okay, Channel 4, if you want to listen to what Dr. Ndoen will say in English. Dr. Ndoen will speak in French. And please put to Channel 4.
You all right? Ready? Okay. Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente, qui a bien géré la séance. Merci pour... Merci pour les panélistes qui ont fait des interventions très importantes. Vous savez que les peuples autochtones, après je reviens vers toi, la chance des peuples autochtones, c'est qu'ils sont partout dans le monde, en Asie, en Afrique, en Amérique latine. Et cette disparition dans le monde leur a donné des spécificités extraordinaires. Des spécificités, comme a dit notre ami, qui trouvent des solutions aux problèmes. Donc, la question, c'est comment on peut conjuguer toutes ces spécificités très importantes pour trouver des solutions de changement climatique, mais aussi des solutions pour les peuples autochtones. Concernant les peuples autochtones d'Afrique, parfois, ces peuples autochtones ne sont pas compris par les gouvernements, par la société civile, mais les peuples autochtones en Afrique, ils ont des savoirs traditionnels extraordinaires concernant la gestion de l'eau dans la région de la Méditerranée, mais aussi dans le Sahel. Le Sahel, ils sont des génies, ils sont des ingénieurs du pastoralisme. Parfois, il arrive que quelques peuples autochtones ou quelques comités locaux qui s'infiltrent entre les peuples autochtones qui ne comprennent pas les traditions des peuples autochtones peuvent commettre des erreurs. Ça, c'est une réalité. Nous, en tant qu'experts des peuples autochtones, nous n'avons pas une approche romantique de savoir traditionnel. On doit dire la réalité, mais il faut savoir aussi que les peuples autochtones en Afrique sont marginalisés. Peut-être quelques réactions sont le résultat de la marginalisation. Donc, il faut absolument faire une analyse correcte, une analyse réaliste de la situation. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ndoen, for providing that question. We don't know where we would be without you, because as I said, we are indigenous peoples from Asia. So we are very lucky that we have Ndoen here to address the question. And indeed, from my experience in talking to the pastoralists from the Maasai areas in Tanzania and in Kenya, they have been frequently moved out of their traditional ranges. So sometimes it can be misunderstood when they go through the traditional rangelands of their cattle, and it can be perceived as violation of laws. But actually, they are just following the traditional trails, and they are just practicing pastoralism in their traditional territories. So it's important to make these distinctions. Of course, we cannot answer specifically on Nigeria because we don't have anyone here from Nigeria. But I hope we were able to answer her question. She has left now. Are there other questions from the audience or anything that you would like to share with our panelists? Yes, please.
Okay, I will just use experience that I'm Dr. Juskan Jungep from Cameroon, from local NGO. So we are talking about conflict. In Cameroon, we have two types of indigenous people: the one living in the forest and the one living in the savannah area. So in Cameroon, we see that most of conflict come from the land management system. The documents used for land allocation by government are really old from now. And us, like NGO, local NGO, try to address this problem using participatory mapping and community land use planning to see what is the space used by communities and what's the extent of land allocation by government on the impact of that extent to the community's activities, mainly livelihood, because as the doctor just said, communities' livelihood, local, especially in the local communities, participate more on the climate change mitigation. And they are mostly in the adaptation. The most, with the cultural knowledge, they participate more. I would like to see, from those participatory mapping, we are able to address conflict and categorize those conflicts, both from the forest area and from the savannah area. So I would like to know how, from the Asia area, have you been able to integrate these two on your own conflict management? Because I've learned from you what you have to do. But also, you see, from the participatory mapping, we help the community to decide how the land should be used to mitigate climate change or for future development. So these are the things that we use to bring communities together, and from there they will learn how they have tools to enable government changes in the law that are used for management of land. So this is a specific tool that I wanted to share with the team of Asia, so that they should know what is Cameroon, because indigenous people are not the same in all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And are there others so that we can collect questions that the panelists can answer? Okay, if there, sorry? I don't see. If there are none at the moment, okay, if there are none at the moment, I would like to call on Mrinal first to answer the direct question on conflict. And then I would like to invite the rest of the panelists to share their perspectives on the questions that have been asked so far. So Mrinal, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for showing your interest, because it's really important to talk about this very openly. You know, sometimes conflict, we see latent conflict, we cannot see, which is not visible, but there are conflicts, there are injustice. Sometimes we can a little bit see, we can see a little bit, no, visible conflict, and sometimes we see open conflict. So open conflict is good to give treatment, because when we see everything, we can diagnose, no, the problem, the conflict. Then it is good to provide medicine. It's like, you know, so in that sense, I think it is good that, yeah, you can say on your own perspectives. Even when you do the conflict mapping, you will do on your own. And when I do, I'll be biased, because none is they are neutral, no. So that's why in this kind of conflict transformation approaches in the practice, when we do the conflict analysis mapping, so it is important to bring all stakeholders, all actors. Here comes the indigenous peoples, involvement, engagement. We want to be engaged, and here we always in the conflict transformation. I also think that hearing and listening, we have to be very clear on that. Our voice can be heard, but if it is not listened properly, like what our moderator Jing Corpuz was saying, we have to be listened by them. Here in this conflict conference, we all come here just to say. After I finish my saying, I go out. I never listen to others. But the most important thing is we have to know how to listen to others. We have to go deeper, deeper, deeper. Otherwise, there will be misunderstanding. Oh, indigenous peoples are very bad. They come like this, kill, all these things. No, we have to understand very deeply why indigenous peoples behave like this. What is the causes? What are the causes of indigenous peoples behaving like this if they behave like this? No? So we cannot just blame. So we have to bring the facts from the ground. I cannot say you're right, you're wrong here, no, because I don't know the facts in your country. But I think we need to get involved, no, because what we are talking is we all want peace. We say we are peace builders, no. So if we want to build peace, then we have to understand that way. Thank you.
Thank you. Pasang, would you like to go next? Yes. 2 minutes.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the question. I do not have a direct question, but just in line with the question that has been raised here, I just would like to say, like, one of the main reasons of the conflict is our perspectives, no, our understanding, and as I totally agree with Mrinal, how depth understanding you have on that one, the causes. I just would like to share one example. In national park in Nepal, we indigenous people, especially Chepang and Raute, who are still living in the forest, they have been projected as a causes of the conflict. But the conflict is here in Nepal, especially in the national park. is indigenous people who have been living there even before the establishment of the national park, and who believe that natural resources are theirs. They do not know it's a national park or not, but they believe that as a part of their resources. So they just would like to continue the traditional governance system, livelihoods. And in the COVID, what happened recently, that most of the young generation were not allowed to continue the traditional governance system because of the rules of national park, who were working in the cities as a cheap labor in the restaurants or like that. But either COVID, everything shut down. There's no food in the city. So they have to go back to their home. And for the survival, to feed their family, feed their children, the youth who came from the city, they went to the forest to collect herbs, fruits, and fishing for their families. They were arrested. Many of them were arrested, fined, and one was beaten to death. It's a big protest in Nepal. And later, the news coming up that it was because they violated the rules of national park. So it's very important to understand how the causes of the conflict. So I'm not a conflict expert, but as you are already aware that where indigenous people go, so they are really doubly victimized in the COVID. Forget about the climate change, So there are a lot of things that causes of the conflict. So that is why the RRI reports comes to the fact that in post-biodiversity framework, 30 by 30, the governments are expecting to increase conservation by 30% by 2030. If that continues without addressing the indigenous people issues, and also coming up without right-based conservation, this will create further conflict and eviction of indigenous people, like we have already seen in the case of Kankajan Forest Complex in Thailand. I'm also the representative to the UNESCO World Heritage from Asia, and we have already had a really bitter experience. So we can share maybe later next time. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Pasang. Monica, please.
Yeah, just to add something about the conflicts. Like, we have to be clear here that indigenous peoples used to live in peace before all these big projects, conservation, national park came to our community. And in many indigenous communities, from what I know, because in my organization, I'm also in charge for case handling. So for the cases that involve indigenous peoples. And in many indigenous communities, conflicts are created, even internally. The outsiders, for example, the company, use money to buy some of the leaders. And it's not their fault. They use money to buy some of the leaders, and then they create conflict among them. And that happened in many indigenous communities. So the conflict is not created by indigenous peoples itself, but because of all these factors, the conflict is there. So the conflict is not only indigenous peoples with the outsiders, but also among them, created by all of these factors. And on the question of, well, in Indonesia, we're doing this land mapping, and it also included the land use management of indigenous peoples. So if we talk about, for example, the state, the government, they have this conservation program, national park. Well, if the government really want to involve indigenous peoples in this, the protection of the nature, we can just use the community-based conservation, right? And then the government can work hand in hand with indigenous peoples to protect the nature with all this traditional knowledge. Because in the land mapping that we do, we have this, the map of land use management of indigenous peoples. There's this sacred forest that they cannot cut down any trees in that forest. And it is also legally binding for the community because they have their own law, which is customary law. So if there is a member of the indigenous communities do harm to that sacred forest, they will be punished, right? So there's that rules that trying to protect, you know, our territories, and it's just a matter of political will of the government to involve indigenous peoples and to end the conflicts with indigenous peoples.
Thank you very much, Monica. Rodion?
Yes, I will try to be very brief because I'm not an expert and specialist on conflict. But from my general observation, there are two main factors under any kind of conflicts. The first one, it's a race for resources, basically economic or natural resources. And the second one, it's interethnical relations, so which is very hard to evaluate. But for me, the most critical point is how to solve any kind of conflict, how to create a tool and principles. So based on my personal experience, I would like to highlight some key points from indigenous people prospect. The first one is recognition of indigenous rights and their traditional knowledge. At any level, at the state level, under the legal framework, but it should be a strong commitment to recognize indigenous people rights. The second point, it's a strong self-committed and self-organizing of indigenous peoples if they would like to negotiate or to find a proper solution. And the third point is the high level of negotiation as much as possible. And the fourth principle, to come to written agreement, to written paper, not just to discuss orally and then, afloat at the end of the meeting. So that is, I think, the best tool and principle how we can work with any kind of stakeholders, government and NGOs and any community. So, and finally, just also very bright example. It's not inclusive, it's more exclusive. But after 3 years of very hard and top negotiation with Moscow, with my community, we finally accept to create national park in our traditional territory. And they accepted most of our demands. The first demand, we are still having access to our traditional land. More than 70% of the national park territory belong to traditional activity. We have created a permanent council under the national park management. And the chair of this council is a deputy director of the national park in charge of indigenous rights and traditional activity. The main headquarters of national park is based in our village, in our community, not at the regional capital, not in Moscow. So, and around 90% of the park staff are hired from local and indigenous peoples. So that is 5 key principles, but it took 3 years of negotiation. And finally, 3 years ago, the UNESCO provide to our territory grant of World Heritage status. It's the highest environmental status in the world. That is also very complementary to us. And finally, just a figure, we are talking about around 2 million hectares of the forest belonging to us. So that is a very inclusive case, and we can proud and would like to share maybe one day with other people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rodion. And we have, let me check, 8 minutes remaining, maybe time for one question before I ask for final words from the panelists. Is there someone? Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for your time and for your words. I'm interested, you mentioned something about the conflict also comes from having so many different perspectives, and also just having a lot of indigenous people across the globe with different perspectives. So I'm wondering, in terms of a space like this, and also in terms of trying to get governments to listen or institutions to listen, how do you do that? How do you organize in, I guess, in your own countries, but also in your own communities, and then also in a space like this? How is this useful to you, and is this space useful to you? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Who would like to answer? I think that's, thank you, Pasang. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you for the question. The different perspectives is one of the causes of conflict. So what I just share what we have been doing. So every activities, whatever we do in relation to the rights of indigenous people, in relation to the indigenous people's education and curriculum, in relation to the capacity buildings and climate change resilience, anything, issues and concerns in relation to climate change or resources or land management or in relation to policy and programs, when you do it at the community levels, we always invite the local government. We humbly invite. There's a resistance, no doubt, but we make sure they come to the program. And they are also sensitized. And, in our experience in the working in the past few years, I think it's already been almost 15 years since I've been working, engaging local governments at the local level, national level, as well as linking with the different parties at the global level. It works. But the most important part is sensitization. Make them feel the importance of us and their values, our values. They recognize our values is important. And sensitization process is not that easy, but it takes a time, but there is a way out. That is my experience. Then, do I have time or no?
No more.
Okay, yeah, I can talk after this one. I can talk hours and hours, but we can maybe catch up after this one. Yeah, but it's possible. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And we have 5 minutes remaining. So I would like to ask you for your final words, your last key message. 1 minute.
Yes, I think although it is not discussed that much, because sometimes we say conflict, we see conflict as negative things, no? But we don't see conflict as positive things. So we need to think conflict as a positive things to move ahead constructively. Conflict is not always bad thing, because conflict, in fact, the good thing, if we can deal it properly, if we have the good intention to move it towards the peace building. So in that sense, I think although it is quite new, but we need to continue this kind of discussion. In the beginning, we may have some differences, but at least, as question was asked, at least we have some shared values. We may not have agreed values, but we may have some shared values. That is, I think, an important thing. Thank you.
Yeah, finally, I just would like to add that, if we keep on sensitizing our state parties and with faithful manner, and they will be our advocator. This is my experience from the ground level, from the national level, working almost for 15 years already now. They becomes our advocator, and they will raise the issues of indigenous people when they form the policy and programs. And that we have experiencing already while we are having the local laws that recognize indigenous rights, customary institution, our knowledge by the local laws, which is already happening on the ground. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, just short words. Many reports have shown the big role of indigenous peoples in the mitigation and adaptation of climate change. And I think even in this COP, we have heard many commitments met by many governments from many countries. And I think this is a time to acknowledge the big role of Indigenous peoples in protecting the Mother Earth. And it's not only on paper, not only during the speech, not only on, in the NDC or, written in the Paris Agreement, but it should be translated into action at national and local level so we can see the real thing happen on the ground, protection and recognition of Indigenous peoples, which allow us to contribute to the protection of Mother Earth.
Rodion?
Tomorrow I am leaving home, so I'm quite happy. Frankly speaking. So it's now my last panel under this scope. So my final comments and message to my brothers and sisters and to all of you, just we have to keep understand that the climate change negotiation is a very centralized process, particularly in terms of decision. We still believe what the head of state already said and signed during the first 2 days, focusing on forest protection, on land rights, which sounds good for us. But it's not enough, because now it's timely and turn to humanize the climate change process. And we should put peoples first, particularly on the ground, because it's very easy to make a decision sitting in big or buildings without having in mind what's happening at the ground. It's not so easy, but I believe after this scope particular, all of us, we come to more understanding and we come to more actions, because we don't need any kind of introduction. We need already actions and measures. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rodion, and we are so privileged to be the last panel that you are at. So we are very happy that you are spending your last hours of COP26 with us. And again, as usual, thanks for the wise words. And I hope that why am I using this? I hope that we have now a brief glimpse, at least, as to how Indigenous peoples in Asia are contributing to climate action. And, if our rights are recognized, our tenure is secured, we can be doing so much more. So I hope that this is the message that has also that you have also received. And thank you very much to the panelists, and thank you all for attending this session.